Hi, my name is Angel. Welcome back to my channel and Happy New Year! I was reading up until the last day of 2023, so now that the year is over, we can finally sit down and go through all of my reading stats for last year. So I use a reading tracker on Google Spreadsheets, and I know absolutely nothing about creating spreadsheets or using any sort of, what is the word I'm looking for? Software? I don't know. Anything like that, I have no idea. But there are plenty of people in the world that do know what they're doing and so kindly create reading trackers and upload them to the internet so that people like me who don't know anything about that can download those and use them for their own reading tracking. So this was a template created by this person. I'll put their or whatever up on the screen here. So they created this, and basically I just go through and I put in every book that I read, and then it gives me these cute little graphics and these little pie graphs, right? Pie charts of stats for the things that I read. So we're just gonna look at those today. It's a very chill, relaxing video for the new year. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with the number of books that I read 215 books in 2023. So now we can look at this little chart that is going to tell me how much I read in each month. So in January, I read 12 books, February 19, March was 13, April was 24, May was 23, June was 20, July was 18, August was 12, September was 16, and then my best reading month for the year was October with 25 books. And then November I had 18 and December I had 13. So, like I said, October was my best, and then I guess the lowest reading months would be January and August, which I had 12 in, but 12 is usually my baseline goal for the month. Like if I can read 12 books a month for the year and get 144 by the end, then I am happy with that, although I usually do read more than that and end up striving to read more than that. But I had a very good reading month every month, so that is really awesome. So this next little pie chart is going to tell us how I read books. I read mostly physical books, but according to this, I did read 91 ebooks. As far as physical books, 66 were hardcovers and 58 were paperback. So I don't know what that says about me, but it's interesting. This is a really interesting one, where I got these books from. So just over half of the books that I read last year came from the library. I had 120 library books that I read. Underneath that, we have 35 from Kindle Unlimited, so I would say I'm getting my money's worth for that. I thrifted 23 books, bought brand new 16 books. 13, I had an ARC from most likely NetGalley, and then 7 of the books that I read were gifted to me by somebody else, and only 1 book was borrowed from a different person. So when we add up how much I thrifted and how much I bought and how much was a gift, then we get 46 books that would have been from a physical TBR throughout the year, which is not a lot when you compare 46 to 215. But then again, over half of what I read comes from the library, so I'm supporting my local libraries. Next up is this little crazy graph. It's kind of all over the place, but this shows the publication date of the books that I read. So I read the most books that were published in 2023 with 58 books. And then 2022, I read 32 books, and then 23 books that I read were published in 2021, so a lot of more recent things. But this graph is very scattered. We have random years like 1945, 1961, 1978, 1981, which I think is just funny and very interesting to see all the random little years that I read from. But it does look like a lot of what I read is newer. This next one is not going to be a shock to anybody, but 201 of the books that I read were in the adult age range, which, like I said, is not a shock. I don't typically read other age ranges. I read 12 YA or young adult books, and then 2 that were classified as new adult, which I'm still not entirely sure what that means. Like, I know what it means, but I'm also like, I don't know. It's just one of those things that is like very weirdly specific. But 201 were just in the straight up adult age range. Moving on now, we are gonna look at authors. So the first little thing we have is whether the author was new to me or somebody I was familiar with. So out of the 215 books that I read, 141 of them were by authors that were new to me, and then 72 of them were by authors that I was familiar with or had read from before. So that's very interesting. I've discovered a lot of new authors this year, which is really fun. When we look at author gender, I primarily read from female authors. It appears I read 107 books by female authors, 90 books by male authors, and then non-binary I read 9, and then also where it says collab I read 9 as well, which is books where there's more than one author, or if it's like an anthology. I can't go through and list every single author. So 9 books I read were by various different people. The one thing that this didn't chart is like how many different authors I read from. So I went through and counted, and I may or may not be correct in my counting, but apparently I had 173 different authors that I read from. So there were definitely a few authors that I read from more than once, but overall 215 books, 173 different authors. And if we're going based off of that, my top authors, or the ones that I read the most from this year, were a tie. I had Grady Hendrix and Eric LaRocca, who I both read 4 different books from this year, which makes sense. Eric LaRocca is one of my favorite authors. I absolutely love everything that he writes. I've never given anything less than a 4-star from Eric LaRocca, so very, very excited to pick up some more of his new stuff that is coming out in the next year. Absolutely cannot wait. Okay, the next one we're looking at is my star rating. So it looks like by far I gave out the most 4 stars in 2023. I had 56 4-star books and 52 5-star books, which is really, really nice because I feel like when I kind of think back on it, I don't realize that I've read that many 5 stars. I feel like a lot of times I will give books like a 3, or they'll just be kind of average for me. So to look back and see that I did read 52 5-star books is really, really interesting. But then it also gets me curious to see, do those 5 stars hold up? Because I'm sure there are things that I read at the beginning of the year where my rating wasn't as, I don't know the word, not strict, but like I just had a different rating style and I didn't really think about it too hard, and I would just give it like 5 stars. So I don't know if everything that I rated 5 stars this year will hold up, but it is nice to see. I think Goodreads said that my average rating for the year was 3.7, which checks out if the most, what am I trying to say? The rating that I gave out the most was 4 stars. So after that, I gave out 32 3 stars, 28 3.5 stars, 17 2 stars, 12 4.5 star books, 9 books I did not rate, which happens sometimes, a lot of times with like nonfiction or like memoirs. Sometimes I won't rate. Also, if I read a book and I'm like, I don't really feel like a rating is fair, sometimes that'll happen. For example, I read Leech earlier this year, and I think it's a fantastic book and very, very unique, but it was a lot of complicated things that I don't think my brain fully comprehended. So I just didn't feel like giving that one a rating because I don't know if I fully understood everything enough to rate it, but I did enjoy it. So sometimes that happens. I had 9 books that I did not give a rating to. 5 books I gave 2.5 stars, and I had 4 1-star books for the year, which I don't give out a lot of 1 stars, so that makes sense. 4 out of 215, so that's pretty good. It was overall a pretty good year, it seems. And moving on to my last category, which I think is the most interesting in my personal opinion, this is all of the genres that I read this year. And I'm sure it is no surprise to anybody that horror was my number one genre. I read 110 horror books in 2023, and I think it's really funny because we go down to my number two genre, and that is thriller and mystery, which I read 29 of. And it's just a very big jump, I think, from 110 to 29. You can definitely tell one of those genres stands out a lot. Then moving on to nonfiction, I read 20 of those. I read 17 romance books, 13 general fiction. I read 12 sci-fi books, which I think is really interesting because I like to think of myself as somebody who reads sci-fi a lot more than that, but I guess not really. So I definitely want to explore more sci-fi in 2024. If you guys have any recommendations for me, definitely leave them down below. This is my little sci-fi shelf right here. Project Hail Mary, one of my favorite books in the whole entire world. So give me sci-fi recs if you have any, because I want to make that number more than 12 next year. Then I read 4 fantasy books. I read fantasy for the first time this year, and that is definitely a genre that I'm going to read more of and explore more in the new year. Then we had a tie for magical realism and dystopia. I read 3 books in each of those categories. And then another tie with classics and literary fiction. I read 2 books in each of those categories, which is really interesting because literary fiction I don't really ever read, but every time I do read it, I really, really enjoy the books. For example, if I read 2 literary fiction this year, but my top book for the year was a literary fiction book, I feel like that tells me I should read literary fiction more often, right? But I feel like sometimes I get maybe intimidated or just like not really feeling it because I know that I'll have to put a lot of brain power into it, which I do enjoy doing. But the other thing with literary fiction too is I feel like anytime I read literary fiction, I want to be able to annotate and add tabs to different things. And obviously, as we can tell, a lot of the books I read I get from the library. You can't really annotate those. So that's a predicament that I'll have to deal with in the future because I want to read literary fiction and I want to annotate literary fiction, which means I have to own the books, but I don't like to spend money. So what am I going to do? I don't know. I'll get over it, I suppose. Anyways, that was all of my stats for 2023. I just think it's so fun and so interesting to look at your own book stats. I'm sure a lot of you guys probably don't care that much because it's not your own reading, but there is something about sitting there and analyzing your own reading that is so fun. Just like with Spotify Wrapped, when those come out, how it's so fun to like analyze them and post them everywhere, even though you know that the other people don't really care about it. It's just a fun thing to do. And I'm definitely going to be using a reading tracker again in 2024, but I'm going to try out a different template. I found one that goes a lot more in depth. So I'm going to have to look at that and really figure out what's going on because I looked at it one time and I was like, that's a lot and I'm confused. So I'll come back to this later. But I think it's fun to get these little stats and graphs and things for the end of the year. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully I will see you next time, and once again, Happy New Year. I hope we all have a fantastic 2024 reading year.